The year is 1453. The first light of dawn touches the domes and walls of Constantinople, and the city breathes as it has for more than 1,000 years. But this morning the air trembles with a new sound. Iron throats of cannons beating against stone. The rumble of a sea of men gathered to end an empire. The queen of cities, guardian of the straits between two continents, is about to face her last trial. What happens here will close one chapter of the world and open another. By nightfall, a new banner may fly where emperors once walked. For centuries, Constantinople stood at the hinge of Europe and Asia, a marketplace of ideas and of goods, of faith and ambition. Founded by Constantine the Great and crowned with a shimmering basilica of Hagia Sophia, it was where Roman law spoke Greek and caravans met Gauls beneath mosaics of gold. Behind its ramparts, the triple lines known as the Theodosian Walls. Generations found refuge from Goths, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and even Crusaders. Siege after siege had broken on those stones and rolled back into the sea. The city was a promise that civilization could outlast the storms. But empires are not immortal. By the mid-5th century, the Byzantine world had shrunk to the city itself and a handful of hard-pressed territories along distant coasts. Trade had ebbed, coffers had thinned, and arguments over church and politics divided potential allies. The Ottoman state, vigorous and expanding, pressed on every frontier. In Edirne, a young ruler studied maps and prophecies and weighed the fate of a city he had never yet ruled, but already imagined as his. He understood that whoever held Constantinople held a key to empire and a claim to Rome's long shadow. Mehmed too became sultan in 1451. Barely into manhood, he was disciplined, secretive, and relentless. Many misread his calm as softness. They would learn otherwise. He dreamed not only of victory, but of legitimacy, of binding his empire to the Roman inheritance through possession of its heart. He strengthened his navy, gathered engineers and masons, and raised a fortress on the European shore of the Bosporus at its narrowest point, a stone fist closing on the throat of the strait. Ships passing toward the city felt the news grow tighter. The Sultan was teaching Constantinople to live with the idea of siege. Among the experts he drew to his service was a master founder named Orban, from bell metal and patient. Labor grew monstrous bombards, barrels of bronze, capable of hurling stones like millstones. They were not nimble weapons. They ate powder, cracked carriages, and needed hours to cool. But they were hammers built to test a legend. In workshops that glowed with furnace light, the bronze cooled, was bored, and finally hauled by teams of oxmen and men toward the city that believed itself unbreakable. The age of walls was about to meet the age of guns. Across the water, Emperor Constantine, the 11th Paleologos, walked his walls. He was heir to a weary dynasty, a ruler without the armies his ancestors commanded, and yet courageous. Where treasure could not be found, he sought allies. Bishop and merchant, Venetian, Genoese, Greek soldier and monk, all were folded into a defending force that numbered in the low thousands. The Genoese captain, Giovanni, a veteran of sieges, became the steel at the city's most threatened stretch, the valley of the Lus. If courage could be poured into gaps, he meant to pour it. In the first days of April, the Ottoman host advanced. Tents flowered like a city of cloth around the land walls. Cannon pits were dug, platforms raised, and the Sultan's standards planted before the gate of St. Romanes, key to the western approach. Trumpets braided, drums rolled, and the siege began. Day after day, the bombard shook the soil, hurling stone against stone, while sappers crept forward to mine foundations, and archers sent black-feathered messages toward the parapets. At night, the defenders worked by torch and prayer, dragging rubble into shattered mouths of wall, shoring the old defenses with timber and hope. At sea, a tiny victory flared. A convoy bearing grain and men fought its way up the Bosphorus, and in a furious battle forced entry into the Golden Horn, despite Ottoman fire. Cheers rang from the walls. Bells answered in the city. For a day, hope lifted heads and steadied hands. Yet the ember was small and the wind was against it. The Basir settled to their long work with patience sharpened by command. Engines multiplied, trenches broadened, and the ring tightened around the exhausted heart of Byzantium. Mehmed's imagination did not keep to the ground. If a chain barred his ships, then the ships would avoid the chain. In a feat observers would later recount with disbelief, he ordered vessels dragged overland on greased timbers from the Bosphorus to the sheltered waters of the Golden Horn. One dawn centuries gazed down from Galata's heights, and saw Ottoman mass when none had floated the night before. The harbour, long the city's inner lung, now wheezed under enemy presence. No flank was safe. No prayer could pretend the sea itself was a wall. Inside the city, the days acquired a rhythm. Prayer at dawn, labour under bombardment, sorties at dusk, counsel by lamplight. Food grew scarce. Stone dust choked throats. Yet the will to resist did not slacken. Constantine reminded his people that they were guarding more than houses. They were guarding an inheritance of faith and memory, of libraries and churches and graves. Some still hoped that the West would come in force, that banners of a new crusade would rise on the horizon. Letters went out. Promises drifted back. The hours of waiting were measured in cannon blasts. Assaults tested the walls again and again. Siege towers inched forward and burned beneath jars of fire. Ladders rose and toppled. Where the bombards loosened great stones, Justiniani's men stood in the smoke, crossbow and handgun biting into the press. The Sultan tried tunnels. The city countered with listening wells, bowls of water trembling to betray the tap of picks. When mines were found, defenders broke into them with sudden fury, fighting in the strangled dark. Night after night, the cracked, patched, trembling line held. Weeks passed. Spring tilted towards summer. The Sultan, impatient of delay and mindful of supplies, convened his council. Some advised withdrawal. The walls, after all, were stubborn, and the season advanced. Mehmed rejected retreat. He ordered a general assault and prepared his army for a storm that would either crown him with prophecy or drown his name in defeat. In the camp, smiths hammered, ladders were bound, and prayers rose with the smoke. On the walls, the defenders tightened belts and resolved to stand wherever the stone failed them. The night before the final attack, the city prayed. Processions wound through streets, icons borne in steady hands, chants rising beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia. By torchlight, soldiers embraced one another on the battlements. The emperor spoke plain words. He could not promise victory, but he promised to die among them. Across the lines, imams preached of paradise and glory. Fires dotted the Ottoman camp like a second starfield fallen to earth, and the drums throbbed like the heartbeat of an army that had decided not to sleep. Before dawn on May 29th, drums rolled and horns called. The first wave surged, irregular troops, fierce and many, thrown at the walls to tire and thin the defenders. They were met with bolts and shot, with stones and boiling pitch, with a stubborn human wall of men who refused to yield. When that torrent recoiled, another followed. The Sultan's Anatolian soldiers, better armed, better drilled, pushing ladders into shattered places, shouting the names of God and empire. Again, the line bent, in places it split. The defenders closed the tiers with bodies and planks, with pikes and prayers. Then the trumpets sounded for the elite. The Janissaries advanced in order, shields and matchlocks raised, steps beating time with the drums. They moved toward the battered heart near the gate of St. Romanus, where the heavy guns had gnawed a path. In the smoke and dawn light, fighting turned to a fever of moments. A banner rose on a broken tower. A captain fell. A narrow posture near the Black Herney, long neglected, gaped open, and through it attackers spilled like water, finding a crack in rock. Rumor outran certainty, and rumor in battle can be a weapon. In the press of that hour, Justin Ninny, so long the hinge of the defence, was gravely wounded. Carried from the breach, he left a vacuum no brave heart could quickly fill. Constantine, armoured and unadorned, threw himself where the danger was greatest. The city has fallen, but I am still alive. The chronicles remember him crying as he vanished into the meal. With the emperor's disappearance, the last cords binding command frayed, and the Ottoman tide gathered over the broken wall like surf over a reef at low water. Once the Janissaries crowned the breach, resistance shattered into pockets. Standards appeared on the ramparts. Gates were forced from within. The flood that had been held for weeks spilled into the city's arteries. Bells rang, screams followed, and a great weight of grief seemed to settle, as if the stones themselves understood what was ending. By midday, the Sultan rode through streets choked with smoke and clamour and halted before Hagia Sophia, where thousands had sought sanctuary beneath the great dome. There he ordered that the basilica be preserved as a place of worship, its fate sealed in a few words. He prayed on its floor, then set about the work of making a ruined capital breathe again. Looting was curtailed. Orders went out to spare craftsmen and scholars. The city which had bled would now be bound. From conquest, Mehmed meant to fashion legitimacy, not merely a victory, but a new imperial centre that could claim the inheritance of Rome in a different tongue and under a different sign. News of the fall raced through courts and ports. To some, it was a disaster, almost apocalyptic. To others, a long, expected turning of the wheel. We cannot weigh precisely how many scholars fled west or how many manuscripts they carried, but we can see the tide of Greek learning thickening in Italian cities afterward, in the shop of a printer, in the studio of a painter, in the study of a mathematician. Old words acquired new life. The Renaissance did not begin with the fall, but the fall quickened currents already stirring. Trade to found new courses. With overland routes constrained and new tolls rising, kingdoms stared harder at the map's margins. If spices and silk could not be had reliably through the old paths, perhaps the ocean would yield a better road. In Lisbon and in Castile, ships were fitted with stronger masts and bolder hopes. A generation after the siege, sails crossed waters few Europeans had dared to test. The world that opened was larger, stranger, and often cruel, but the desire to reach it had been stirred by changes that began at these walls. For the Ottomans, the capture was a beginning. The court moved from Adiran to the city by the Narrows, and it blossomed into an imperial capital. Mosques lifted new silhouettes against the skyline. Markets recovered, Baths steamed, schools open, craftsmen from many lands settled under the Sultan's protection. Communities of faith were organized under their own leaders, a pattern that allowed diversity while affirming the state's supremacy. From this hub, armies would stride into the Balkans and toward the Arab heartlands, while caravans and fleets stitched together a realm of 3 continents. What ended was equally momentous: the Eastern Roman Empire, the last fragment of a state that had called itself Roman for more than a millennium, came to its close. Its law codes, its theological debates, its art, its stubborn insistence on continuity became the inheritance of others. The wisdom of its diplomats and the grandeur of its worship sank into memory even as their echoes persisted in liturgies and in domes raised far from the Bosphorus. A thread running from the age of Constantine to the age of cannons snapped, and a new spool began to unwind. The fall offered lessons to generals. Artillery proved what many suspected, that the high curtain walls of the medieval world were vulnerable to the patient thunder of guns. Fortification did not vanish, but it changed. Angular bastions replaced round towers. Earthworks swallowed stone. The battlefield's grammar evolved, and with it the rhythms of power. In this city's ruin, architects and captains read a manual for the next century of war, while kings counted the cost of ignoring it. It also offered lessons to rulers. Mehmed's triumph was not only the fruit of force, it was the fruit of organization, supply, foresight, and the ability to weld innovation to tradition. He used foreign talent without yielding authority, and he understood that symbolic acts entering Hagia Sophia, declaring protections, presenting himself as heir to an imperial mantle, could bind people as surely as laws. Constantine's stand, for its part, taught something different but enduring. That legitimacy and courage can hold despair at bay even when numbers cannot. And to the people who lived through it, the artisans who patched walls, the sailors who hauled rope until their hands bled, the mothers who hushed children under echoing vaults, the fall was not a chapter in a book. It was the end of homes and the beginning of exile or adaptation. History records emperors and sultans. It whispers about those who carried keys that no longer fit any door. In their stories, the grandeur of events becomes human-sized and therefore real, and the cost of history is counted in hours, names, and empty rooms. 5 centuries and more have passed since that morning when the sun rose over a city and found different banners on its stones by noon. The names by which the city is called have changed in languages and in law, but its position remains what it always was: a gate, a bridge, a prize, a home. Its skyline is layered with eras. Its streets carry footsteps in every tongue. Listen beneath the modern traffic and the call to prayer, and you may still hear the hollow knock of a distant bombard answering back from across the centuries. Why does the fall still matter? Because it gathers into a single event the themes that shape history: ambition and endurance, faith and calculation, technology and tradition. Because it reminds us that empires end not only when their enemies are strong, but when their own seams have worn thin. Because it shows how the collapse of one world can fertilize the ground from which another grows. And because, in a time when borders and identities feel permanent, it whispers that even the highest walls are arrangements of stone and will, not guarantees. We often tell the story as a duel between civilizations. That is too simple. The city's markets had always been cosmopolitan. Its scholars argued with and borrowed from their neighbors. Its conquerors, likewise, inherited more than they destroyed. The line between East and West runs through maps, but it also runs through households, friendships, and the hearts of people who translate, trade, marry, and make. The fall did not erase these crossings. It rearranged them, and in doing so, created new balances and new frictions. As the 15th century rounded into the 16th, the echo of 1453 sounded in different keys. In Rome, popes counted allies and imagined crusades that would never sail. In Venice, merchants recalculated risk. In courts across Europe, crafters stretched parchment and dared to draw coasts they had not seen. In Anatolia and the Balkans, administrators stitched regions into a fabric of law and tax, and the Sultan's chancery issued decrees that wove city and countryside together. A world system reconfigured itself around a new capital at the Straits. There is an image to carry. Imagine the emperor's last moments. The shock of steel, the crush of men at the breerage, the knowledge that the line has given way. Imagine to the young sultan standing beneath the vast dome of a church older than his grandfather's, speaking softly where a triumph might have shouted. Between those two figures lies the hinge of an age, one disappearing into legend, the other stepping onto a stage that would be his for decades. Both stand in the same city and in very different worlds. The city fell. The consequences unfolded over generations. The Mediterranean would never again be the same lake of powers it had been. The Black Sea's gate had a new keeper. The refugee scholar and the apprenticed gun founder each carried part of the future in their hands. And ships nosed westward with compasses and reckonings, born of necessity and desire. The old world did not vanish, but it rearranged itself like glass melted and blown into a new form, bright and dangerous and irresistible. And yet, for all the magnitude, there is a simple truth at the heart of the tale. People chose, worked, feared, hoped, and stood their ground. The fall of Constantinople is not just an ending to mourn or a victory to celebrate. It is a study in human resolve and reinvention. When we look back across the centuries to that dawn, we do not only see walls collapsing and banners rising. We see ourselves caught between what we inherit and what we build, between what we must let go and what we dare to begin. Remember the morning when cannons thundered and prayers rose, when a chain held until ships walked over hills, when a city that had been the guardian of an empire became the foundation of another. Remember the emperor who refused to flee and the sultan who refused to turn back. Remember, above all, that the end of a world is never the end of the world. From the rubble of one age, another lifts its arches toward the light, and the river of history keeps moving, wide enough to carry us.